By the time Belisarius came into the world around 500 AD, the Roman Empire as the ancient world had known it was almost unrecognizable. The western half had effectively ceased to exist in 476 when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. The day is often used as the quote fall of Rome, though the Romans at the time would have found that framing strange. The empire in their minds had not fallen, but moved. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we retrospectively call the Byzantine Empire, carried on from its magnificent capital of Constantinople. The city, which takes its name from Constantine the Great, was founded on the Bosphorus in 330 AD. This city was still Roman in law and identity, but increasingly Greek in culture. The emperor still styled himself as ruler of all Romans, even as the barbarian kings carved up the West. The Western Mediterranean was now a patchwork of Germanic successor kingdoms, each occupying what had been Roman imperial territory. The Visigoths ruled Hispania and southern Gaul. The Franks were consolidating their power in northern Gaul. The Vandals had seized North Africa and even sacked Rome itself in 455. And the Ostrogoths, under their formidable king, Theodoric the Great, controlled Italy and presented themselves as heirs to the Roman Empire. These weren't simply chaotic occupations. Many of these kings admired Rome deeply and thought to preserve its institution. Even as Roman senators who continued to hold office under them, the reality was complex. Over time, Roman and barbarian identities were blending and shifting constantly. But to the east, the Byzantine Empire faced its existential rival, the Sassanid Persian Empire. This was no minor threat. The Sassanids were a sophisticated, powerful civilization that saw themselves as heirs to the ancient Achaemenid Persians, and they now contested control of Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the wealthy trade routes of the Near East. They were already old enemies in the past. Persian and Roman rivalry had already lasted centuries. Wars, truces, and border skirmishes between these two superpowers were a permanent feature of the geopolitical landscape and would become intimately familiar to Belisarius personally. The Roman world was also fractured spiritually. Christianity was the state religion, but it was far from unified. The great theological controversy of the age was Monophysitism, which divided emperors, empresses, clergy, and entire populations. Egypt and Syria leaned heavily towards this belief, while Constantinople and Rome upheld the Council of Chalcedon. This wasn't mere abstract theology, it was serious political consequences, driving wedges between the imperial government and some of its populous and wealthy provinces. The Danube frontier faced constant pressure from migrating people. The Persian frontier demanded enormous resources. The economy, while still the most sophisticated in the Mediterranean world, was burdened by the cost of constant defense. The army had evolved. It was no longer the citizen legionary force of the Republic, but a professional, increasingly cavalry-heavy institution that relied heavily on foederati, barbarian soldiers who fought under Roman command for pay and plunder. And yet, there was an extraordinary energy in this world. Constantinople was a city of perhaps 500,000 people, the largest in the Western world. Its markets hummed with trade from China to Scandinavia. Its universities produced writers and philosophers. This was a world that Flavius Belisarius was born into. But in the eyes of history, Belisarius appears almost fully formed. Who his parents were, where exactly he was born, what his childhood looked like, history simply doesn't tell us. There isn't enough strong evidence, but we do have some ideas. Belisarius was probably born around 500 AD. He is likely from Thrace or Illyria. But whatever his origins, his story begins in 518. Justinian was a nephew of Emperor Justin I, who came to power in 518. He was effectively the most powerful man in the empire after his uncle, acting as a shadow co-ruler throughout the early 520s. Powerful men in the Byzantine Empire maintained private armies of household troops called bucellari, which were elite troops picked from the best of the best. Young men from the frontier provinces of Thrace and Illyria, where Belisarius was likely from, were highly prized as soldiers in Constantinople. These regions produced tough, experienced fighters who grew up near the barbarian frontier. Recruitment was often based on physical ability, reputation, and regional connections. It is very plausible Belisarius was noticed for his physical and military quality and brought into Justinian's service as a teenager or young man. But things would change for Belisarius. In 527, when Emperor Justin I, elderly and in poor health, died in August, his nephew Justinian I became sole emperor of the empire. Justinian almost immediately began elevating and trusting Belisarius with serious military responsibility. The most pressing military threat to the Eastern Empire was the Sassanid Persian Empire to the east. Belisarius was appointed commander of the Roman force in the east, specifically based at the frontier city of Dara in Mesopotamia. Belisarius' task was to defend the eastern frontier and, if possible, push back Persian aggression. He immediately began strengthening fortifications, training and reorganizing his troops. The Persian general Perosus led a large Persian army around 40,000 men toward the Roman fortress of Dara. Belisarius had significantly fewer troops, estimated around 25,000. Rather than retreating behind the city walls, Belisarius made the bold decision to meet the Persians in open battle. He spent days carefully preparing the battlefield before the Persians arrived, digging an innovative system of trenches in front of his lines to protect his flank and disrupt Persian cavalry charges. Once the battle was near, Belisarius placed his infantry in the center. Knowing they were weaker than the Persians, this meant he was keeping them largely as a defensive unit. The reason he did this was because his infantry were not as strong as Persian infantry. In a straight head-to-head clash, the Persian elite heavy cavalry, called the Sevaran, among the finest horsemen in the world at the time. Fighting a straightforward open battle on flat ground would almost certainly mean Roman defeat. His cavalry were positioned on the flanks. He used the trench system to channel and control how the Persian cavalry could attack. The trenches ran parallel to the Roman front line, but with deliberate gaps left open. This meant Persian cavalry could not simply charge straight at the Roman line. They would be slowed down, broken up, before they could build momentum. The gaps in the trenches were exactly where Belisarius wanted the Persians to come through. These were kill zones where Roman cavalry could strike them from multiple angles. This kind of battlefield engineering was rare and sophisticated for the era. Belisarius was essentially designing the battle before it started, rather than just simply reacting to the enemy. Standard Roman and Persian battle formation put heavy infantry in the center as the main striking force, with cavalry protecting the flanks. But in this battle, Belisarius did things differently. Because his infantry were capable of defending, even against superior numbers, they didn't need to advance. By keeping cavalry mobile on the flanks, he could respond to whatever the battle developed and strike at the perfect moment. Another point to mention is by choosing to fight outside the city walls rather than retreat behind them, Belisarius sent a powerful message to his own troops: "We are not hiding, we are fighting." This boosted Roman morale. This also likely surprised the Persians, who might have expected a defensive posture or were not fully prepared for an organized field engagement. The Persians arrived, and there was an individual combat and small skirmishes, almost ritualistic exchanges that were common before ancient battles. Belisarius used his time to finalize his trench positions and study how the Persian commander Perosus was organizing his forces. Before the main battle, a Persian champion came forward and challenged the Romans to a single combat. A soldier named Andreas, a wrestler rather than a soldier, accepted and killed the Persian champion. This electrified Roman morale. When Perosus finally committed to the full battle, the Persian center attacked the Roman infantry line, exactly as Belisarius predicted. His infantry held defensively, absorbing the assault without breaking. The Persian cavalry attacked the Roman left flank in great strength and began pushing it back, but Belisarius had anticipated this moment. He ordered his right flank cavalry, the Harunian unit under a commander named Sunakis, to swipe around the Persian cavalry that was pushing the left flank. The Persians attacking the Roman left suddenly found themselves struck from behind and surrounded. Around 5,000 Persians' cavalry were cut off and destroyed in this encirclement. This collapse on their left broke Persian confidence across the whole battlefield. The entire Persian army then began to retreat. The death toll on both sides was probably in the thousands, but precise figures could not be verified. Beyond the casualties, the consequences of Dara were significant. The Persian army retreated in disorder. They did not attempt to besiege Dara. Perosus, the Persian general, was recalled and disgraced. Losing a major battle carried severe consequences in Sassanid Persia. Belisarius' reputation exploded throughout the empire. News of a Roman general defeating a much larger Persian army in open battle was extraordinary. Justinian was reportedly overjoyed. It validated his faith in his young general completely. The moral effect on Roman troops across the eastern frontier was enormous. They had been on the defensive for years, and this was a genuine stunning victory. After the defeat at Dara, the Persian Shah Kaved I was furious but not finished. The Persians immediately began planning a new offensive. They were a proud empire that had been fighting Rome for generations, and a single battlefield defeat was not going to stop them. Kaved's strategy shifted. Rather than attacking Belisarius directly at Dara again, where the Roman fortifications and Belisarius' defensive preparations made that dangerous, the Persians decided to attack along a different axis entirely. They would strike through Armenia in the north and through the Euphrates corridor in the south, stretching Roman defenses thin. This period between Dara and the next major engagement shows something important about Belisarius. He was not just a battlefield commander, he was actively managing logistics and strategic planning at the same time. This combination of skills were rare. By spring 531, the Persian pressure had intensified significantly. A large Persian army under a general named Azareth crossed into Roman Syria with approximately 15,000 cavalry. Critically, this Persian force included a large contingent of Lakhmid Arab cavalry under their king al-Mundahir. Their strategy was to raid deep into Roman Syria, plundering wealthy cities and demonstrating that Rome could not protect its own territory. If they succeeded in their plan, then it would make Justinian look like a weak ruler who could not protect his lands. Belisarius shadowed the Persian force with his army, avoiding direct battle while harassing their supply lines and trying to cut off their retreat. He was letting the Persians overextend themselves, but his troops, especially his Hunnic allied cavalry, were growing frustrated and relentless. They wanted to fight and plunder. Belisarius' own officers were pressuring him aggressively to give battle before the Persians could escape back across the frontier with their loot. It was on April 19, 531, when the two armies met near the city of Callinicum on the Euphrates River. Belisarius did not want to fight that day. He argued against battle given the conditions of his troops and the strong Persian position, but his officers and soldiers were so insistent that he felt he could not refuse without destroying morale and possibly losing control of his army entirely. The battle itself went badly for the Romans. The Roman left flank held by infantry collapsed under Persian and Arab cavalry. The infantry broke and fled towards the Euphrates River behind them. Many soldiers drowned attempting to cross the river or were cut down fleeing. Belisarius personally fought in the rearguard with his cavalry to cover the retreat. He reportedly fought dismounted at one point, shield in his hand, holding the line with a small group of soldiers to allow others to escape. After his loss, Belisarius was recalled to Constantinople to face an inquiry into his conduct. This was standard Byzantine practice. Generals who lost battles faced accountability. Justinian had enemies at court who used Callinicum to attack Belisarius. For Belisarius personally, the inquiry in Constantinople ultimately cleared him of wrongdoing. The general consensus, then and now, is that he was forced into battle. He did not want to fight, but it was a sobering lesson about the limits of his authority over his own troops. Despite the defeat, the Persians did not achieve a decisive breakthrough. The frontier held, and shortly after, Shah Kavadir died, opening the doors to negotiations. When the Shah died, he was succeeded by his son Khosrow, who became one of the greatest Persian rulers in history. But at this moment, both sides were exhausted. Justinian was eager to free his military resources for campaigns in the west, and Khosrow needed time to consolidate his power after succeeding his father. In 532, the two empires signed what they called the Eternal Peace, a treaty ending the Persian War. The Byzantines agreed to pay a substantial cash payment to Persia, which meant Belisarius was free from the Eastern Front. This treaty was transformative for his career. Justinian now had a bold plan. Use Belisarius to begin reconquering the lost western territories. The dream of restoring the full Roman Empire was about to become an active military campaign. Before this dream could happen, something happened in Constantinople that nearly destroyed everything. Constantinople was politically divided between two chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens. These were not merely sports fans. They were organized political factions with political patronage, networks, and genuine power in the city. Justinian had been trying to curb the power and arrest leaders of both factions. In January 532, the two factions did something almost unpredictable. They united against Justinian. The riots began at the Hippodrome, the massive chariot racing stadium that held 100,000 people, directly adjacent to the imperial palace. Within days, the riots became a full rebellion. Large parts of Constantinople were burned, including the Hagia Sophia. The rebels proclaimed a new emperor, a man named Hepatitis, the nephew of the former emperor. Justinian's own advisors and generals began fleeing. Justinian himself was preparing to flee Constantinople by ship, but Empress Theodora stood up and reportedly said she would not flee. That, quote, the purple makes a fine burial shroud, end quote, meaning she would rather die as an empress than live as a refugee. This speech shamed Justinian and his advisors into staying and fighting back. Belisarius and another general named Mundus were given command of the loyalist forces remaining in the city. Belisarius had a relatively small force of battle-hardened veterans from the Persian frontier, his personal bucalari. The rebels were estimated at 30,000 people and had packed into the Hippodrome with their new fake emperor. Belisarius led his troops directly into the Hippodrome through one of the main gates. What followed was a massacre. 30,000 people were killed in the Hippodrome. This figure is likely exaggerated, but the killing was real and massive. Hepatitis was captured and executed the following day. Without Belisarius' action, Justinian almost certainly would have lost his throne and possibly his life. This also deepened the bond between Justinian and Belisarius enormously. With the Persian frontier pacified and the internal rebellion crushed, Justinian turned his eyes west, starting with North Africa. The Vandal kingdom controlled North Africa, which they had conquered in 429. The Vandals was showing the signs of internal weakness. There had just been a coup. Controlling North Africa would give the Romans a strategic base from which to attack Italy and reconquer the Western Empire, step by step. But many senior advisors thought it was too risky and too far sending an army by sea across the Mediterranean to attack a kingdom of fierce Germanic warriors seemed reckless. They pointed to a previously failed expedition against the Vandals in 468, one of the most catastrophic military disasters in their history, where a massive fleet was destroyed. The financial cost was seen as enormous and potentially ruinous. Two things convinced Justinian to proceed. A bishop from North Africa arrived at court, claiming to have had a divine vision telling Justinian to liberate the Christian population of Africa from the Arian Vandals. News arrived that the new Vandal king Gelimer had overthrown and imprisoned his predecessor, Hilderic, who had been friendly to Constantinople. This gave Justinian a legal and diplomatic pretext for war. Justinian gave Belisarius command of the expedition. The force assembled was relatively small, deliberately so, to avoid alarming the Vandals. Approximately 15,000 soldiers, infantry, and cavalry combined, 92 warships for naval escort, and 500 transport ships carrying the horses, army, supplies, and equipment. The fleet assembled in the harbor of Constantinople in late June. Justinian came to the harbor personally to see them off. The voyage across the Mediterranean was not smooth. The fleet stopped in Sicily, then under Gothic control, where Belisarius secretly managed to gather crucial intelligence. They learned the Vandal king, Gelimer, was not expecting them, and the main Vandal fleet had been sent away to Sardinia to deal with the rebellion there. This was extraordinary, but there was a water shortage on the voyage that caused deaths among the troops. Belisarius had to manage morale and discipline carefully throughout the voyage. That way his men remained determined and loyal. The fleet landed on the North African coast in late August at a place called Cupta Vada, about 150 miles south of Carthage. Belisarius chose this landing point carefully. This gave him enough space from Carthage to give him time to organize before the Vandals could respond. Belisarius issued strict orders that absolutely no plundering of the local population was permitted. This was a political strategy. The local population had been living under Vandal rule for nearly a century. Belisarius wanted them to be seen as liberators, not conquerors. Soldiers actually paid for food from local farmers rather than taking it. The local population responded with genuine warmth toward the army. Belisarius understood that war is politics as much as fighting. By treating the local population well, he was securing his supply lines. Locals would sell them food and provide intelligence. This was also undermining Vandal authority, demonstrating that Roman rule would be better for them. When Vandal king Gelimer finally realized the Romans had landed, he quickly moved. His plan was to divide his forces into 3 columns to catch the Roman army in a converging attack. One force under his brother, Amatus, would attack the Roman front. Another force under his nephew, Jebamond, would sweep around and hit the Roman left flank. Gelimer himself with the main army would strike the Roman rear. If coordinated properly, this could surround and destroy the entire Roman force. But once the battle began, the Vandal plan fell apart. Because of timing failures, the 3 columns did not attack simultaneously. Amatus arrived at the front too early with too few men, attacked prematurely, and was killed along with many of his troops before the other columns were in position. Jebamond's flanking force ran directly into Belisarius' Hunnic cavalry and was essentially destroyed. When Gelimer arrived with the main Vandal army, he found his brother Amatus dead on the battlefield. Gelimer was so overwhelmed by grief at finding his brother's body that he stopped his army. Instead of pressing his numerical advantage, he ordered his men to stop and mourn. This pause was fatal. Belisarius' main cavalry force arrived and hit the stationary, grieving Vandal army with full force. The Vandals broke and fled. A decimum effectively decided the entire campaign in a single afternoon. The road to Carthage was now open. 3 days after the battle, Belisarius and his army marched into Carthage. Carthage had been a great city since antiquity. When the army marched in, the locals lined up in the streets and cheering. Belisarius entered the royal palace and sat in Gelimer's throne. Belisarius and his officers ate the meal that had been prepared for the king that morning. The harbor chain was lowered. The fleet entered, and the Eastern Roman Empire had its first major territorial reconquest in generations. But Gelimer had not given up. He recalled his brother Cezanne and the Vandal fleet from Sardinia, adding a significant force to his army. By December 533, he had rebuilt enough strength to challenge the Romans again. The final decisive engagement took place at Tricamerum, around 20 miles from Carthage. This time, the battle was more straightforward. A direct clash between the 2 armies. Belisarius used his cavalry in repeated charges against the Vandal center before committing his infantry. Cezanne's, Gelimer's brother, was killed in the fighting. When Gelimer saw Cezanne fall, he again broke down psychologically and fled the battlefield. And without their king, the Vandal army collapsed completely. Gelimer fled into the mountains, which was the territory of Moorish tribes. He survived for several months in desperate conditions. Belisarius sent a general named Phares with a force of Herulians to block Gelimer in the mountains. Phares and Gelimer actually exchanged letters during the siege in the mountains. Gelimer's letter described his people starving in the mountains, desperately cold and hungry. He asked Phares to send him a lyre, a sponge, and a loaf of bread. The lyre so he could sing a lament how he composed about his own downfall, the sponge for his inflamed eyes, and the bread because he had not eaten real bread in so long. Gelimer was a tragic figure, a king reduced to begging for bread in the mountains, In early 534, Gelimer finally surrendered. When he was brought before Belisarius, he began laughing uncontrollably, not from joy, but from what had appeared to be a kind of horrified disbelief at the absurdity of his situation. He kept repeating the biblical phrase, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Belisarius treated him with dignity and respect. He was not executed or humiliated. Gelimer was eventually taken to Constantinople, given a large estate, and allowed to live out his life. The Vandal kingdom simply ceased to exist. Belisarius returned to Constantinople in 534, to one of the greatest celebrations in Byzantine history. He was awarded a Roman triumph, the ancient Roman honor given to victorious generals. This was extraordinarily rare in the Byzantine era, and it had not been done in generations. The triumph included a procession through the streets of Constantinople, with Vandal prisoners, treasure, and Gelimer himself walking in chains. Among the treasures on display were the sacred objects looted from Jerusalem by the Romans centuries earlier, and then taken from Rome in 455, including what were believed to be the Temple of Jerusalem's menorah and sacred vessels. A Jewish man in Constantinople saw the sacred Jerusalem treasures in the procession and approached someone at court with a warning. He said that these treasures carried a curse. Everywhere they went, they brought destruction to its holder. Rome had fallen after taking them. The Vandals had fallen after taking them from Rome. Justinian apparently took this seriously enough to send the treasures to Jerusalem, rather than keeping them in Constantinople. Whether true or false, this story was widely circulated and adds a remarkable dimension to the campaign. Justinian awarded Belisarius the title of consul, the ancient Roman office that carried enormous prestige, even if it was now largely ceremonial. It was a mark of favor, but all was not well. Belisarius' spectacular success made him enemies at court. Other generals and courtiers were jealous of his fame, his wealth, and Justinian's favor. Whispers began circulating that Belisarius was too powerful, too popular, and potentially dangerous to the emperor. Justinian himself began showing signs of ambivalence toward his greatest general. This tension between Belisarius' military necessity and the court fear of him would come back later in the future. With North Africa secured, Justinian turned toward Italy as his next target, ruled by the Ostrogoths since 493. The Gothic queen, Amalasuntha, who was a Rome-friendly ruler, had been murdered by a rival Gothic faction. Justinian declared he was avenging her death and restoring Roman rule. Belisarius was given command of the Italian campaign with a shockingly small force of approximately 7,500 men. But why was the force so small? Some argue Justinian deliberately kept the force small because he feared giving Belisarius too large an army. A general with 100,000 men could march on Constantinople and threaten the emperor. Others argue it was simply resource limitations, because North Africa still needed garrisoning. The reality was probably a little bit of both. Justinian trusted Belisarius' genius, but he was always cautious about his power. Belisarius landed in Sicily first, taking it rapidly with almost no resistance. He then crossed to the Italian mainland and began moving north. Naples was taken after a siege. The troops had entered through an old aqueduct under the city walls, a clever solution to a difficult siege. The Gothic garrison and population were treated with relative mercy. This way, local resistance could be kept at bay. But then the time finally came, the most symbolically important moment of the entire campaign. Belisarius entered Rome itself on December 9, 536. This was the first time a Roman emperor's general held the city in generations. The Gothic garrison simply abandoned the city rather than to defend it. At the height of its empire, Rome had a population of perhaps 1 million people, the largest city in the Western world. By 536, the population had collapsed, somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000. Historians debate the exact figure, but the decline was catastrophic. Large parts of the city were abandoned and crumbling. Many of the great ancient monuments were still standing but in bad condition. The aqueducts, Rome's engineering achievement, which had supplied the city with millions of gallons of fresh water daily, were partially functional due to lack of maintenance over time. Some aqueducts stopped working. Many of the great forms and public spaces were either abandoned or had been converted for other uses. The Ostrogoths under their king Theodoric had actually governed Italy with considerable respect for Roman institutions. Theodoric famously said he wanted the Goths to live like Romans and the Romans to live freely. The Senate still met, Roman law still functioned, and Roman families still held their estates. But after Theodoric's death, Gothic rule had become increasingly unstable and violent. By late 536, the Gothic kingdom was in serious disarray. Their king, Theodahad, was deeply unpopular among his own people. He was seen as cowardly, corrupt, and incompetent. Theodahad was more interested in philosophy and accumulating land than in warfare. The Gothic army had already suffered defeats in Sicily and southern Italy. Morale was low, and confidence in their leadership was shattered. The Gothic army actually holding Rome when Belisarius approached was under a commander named Leodorus. The city walls were enormous and required enormous manpower. Rome was surrounded by the Illyrian walls, built in 270s. It was roughly 12 miles in circumference with 383 towers. To defend walls of that length required a massive garrison, far more than Leodorus had. With a depleted, demoralized force, he could not adequately man those walls against a determined attacker. Theodahad had been conducting secret diplomatic contacts with Constantinople, even before the campaign began. He had, at various points, apparently offered to surrender Italy entirely in exchange for a pension and a comfortable life. Leodorus and the Gothic garrison faced the reality. They could not defend the city with the troops they had. Theodahad, by this point, had been deposed and killed by his own people, replaced by a new Gothic king named Viticus, a genuine warrior. But Viticus had made a calculated decision. Rather than trying to hold Rome with an adequate garrison, he would withdraw northward, consolidate his force, and return with a massive army to recapture the city properly. Rome was nearly impossible to supply during a siege. Better to let Belisarius take an empty city and then trap him inside of it. Pope Silverius played an active role in facilitating the peaceful transfer. He had been in communication with Belisarius and had essentially opened the gates using his moral authority over the Roman population to ensure that there would be no resistance. The Pope understood that Rome population would follow his lead, and he chose to welcome the imperial forces. The Roman population lined the streets to watch. People were overwhelmed by emotion at seeing Roman soldiers in Roman streets again. For many Romans, this was a moment they had never expected to see in their lifetimes. But Belisarius did not spend time celebrating. Almost immediately, he began assessing the military situation. He rode the entire circuit of the Illyrian walls, personally inspecting their condition. What he found was deeply concerning. The walls needed repair in multiple sections. He immediately ordered emergency repair work to begin filling gaps and reinforcing weak sections. He organized the city's grain supply, calculating how long he could feed both his troops and the civilian population if besieged. He assessed the water situation. The compromised aqueducts were a serious vulnerability he could not easily fix at the moment. Belisarius understood something his men perhaps did not fully appreciate yet. Viticus and the Gothic army had not been destroyed. They had withdrawn deliberately. Belisarius knew they would return with a far larger force. Belisarius had taken Rome, but with only approximately 5,000 soldiers, a tiny garrison for a city that size. He was essentially setting himself up to be besieged. Belisarius sent an urgent message to Justinian, requesting massive reinforcements immediately. Those reinforcements would be slow, and when the Goths returned, it would be with an army that's around 50,000 men. Rome's grain supply under the Goths had come largely from Sicily and northern Africa via sea. Belisarius now controlled Sicily, but the supply lines were fragile, so he made the deeply unpopular decision to send away much of the civilian population, particularly the poor who could not contribute to the defense. Fewer mouths to feed meant the garrison could hold out longer. When news reached Constantinople that Belisarius had entered Rome, the reaction was reportedly one of joy. The internal city was Rome again, the most powerful symbolic act of Justinian's entire reign. It seemed to validate everything: the enormous expense, the risk, and the years of campaigning. But they weren't safe yet. In February 537, Viticus led his consolidated Gothic army south toward Rome. Viticus had assembled the largest Gothic army of the entire war, drawing warriors from across Italy and beyond. He was determining to recapture Rome and destroy the Roman force. He would encircle Rome completely with a network of fortified camps cutting off all supplies. He established 7 major camps around the city connected by patrol routes. He cut the aqueducts immediately, denying the city water. He would conduct regular assault attempts to wear down the defenders while starvation and thirst did their own work. He also attempted to block the Tiber River above the city to cut off water resupply by boat, though this effort was only partially successful. Viticus understood that with Rome's massive walls, direct assault was costly and probably futile. The plan was to strangle the city slowly. Belisarius personally led a cavalry reconnaissance and force outside the city walls as the Gothic army was approaching. He wanted to assess their strength and position directly. The reconnaissance force encountered Gothic cavalry much sooner than expected, and a sharp skirmish developed. Belisarius fought personally in the skirmish. The Romans were nearly overwhelmed and forced back towards the city. He fought his way back to the Salarian Gate, with his men barely getting inside before the Goths could reach him. By March, the Gothic army had established its camp network and Rome was fully encircled. The siege had officially begun. The grain mills that ground flour for bread were powered by water flowing through the aqueducts. With the aqueducts cut, the mills stopped working. No working mills meant no flour. No flour meant no bread. No bread meant starvation. Belisarius devised a solution. He ordered floating mills constructed and moored into the Tiber River. The mills were built on pairs of boats, with millstones turned by water wheels driven by the river current. This converted the river itself into a power source that the Goths could not cut off. Belisarius organized his 5,000 men into a continuous rotation, some sleeping while others manned the wall. The 12-mile perimeter meant sections of the wall were inevitably thinly held. Soldiers were under constant stress. Any Gothic probe or assault could come at any point along the walls at any time. As the siege extended into weeks and months, the men became exhausted and demoralized. The Romans who remained in the city were caught between loyalty to the liberators and the terrifying reality of a siege. Some wealthy Romans with Gothic connections or Gothic property began questioning whether resistance was wise. Food prices rose as supplies became uncertain. The poor suffered the worst. They had no reserves and depended entirely on whatever distribution Belisarius could organize. The papacy was also the primary institution capable of reaching the poor in need of help. With reduced water, crowding, and stress, disease was a constant presence. Medieval and ancient sieges were typically decided as much by disease as by starvation or assault. From the very beginning of the siege, Belisarius conducted regular offensive sorties, sending cavalry out through the gates to attack Gothic positions. This was psychologically and militarily aggressive. The besieged force was attacking the besieging force. By doing this, it inflicted casualties on the Goths and wore down their strength. This also maintained morale inside the city. Soldiers who are attacking feel less like victims than soldiers who are only defending. By attacking, they gathered intelligence about Gothic positions and strength. It prevented the Goths from ever fully relaxing. They could never be certain when a Roman cavalry force might burst out one of the gates and attack them. In the first weeks of the siege, the sorties went well. Belisarius' cavalry, who were battle-hardened veterans of the Persian and Vandal campaigns, were significantly better individually than Gothic horsemen. These were scenes of Roman cavalry charging Gothic positions, firing arrows from horseback at full speed, and then retreating before the Goths could respond. The Romans had a technological and tactical advantage in cavalry. Archery, the ability to shoot accurately from horseback while moving was a skill that took years to develop, and that the Goths' cavalry largely lacked. Gothic horsemen were primarily shock cavalry. They charged with lance and sword, but could not match the Romans in the fluid style of fighting that Belisarius favored. A Roman cavalry officer named Valentinus led a sortie against Gothic positions near one of the northern gates. The Romans rode out, engaged Gothic cavalry in a running fight, and Valentinus himself killed several Goths in personal combat. But as the Romans were withdrawing, a Gothic warrior managed to cut Valentinus' horse from under him. He was on foot and became surrounded. But a Roman soldier named Acacius turned back alone into the Gothic position, fighting through to Valentinus, pulled him onto his own horse, and rode him back to the Roman line, carrying both of them. Belisarius publicly honored Acacius before the entire army for this brave act. But the sorties became more costly as the siege progressed. The Goths adapted. They set ambushes near the gates, posted strong cavalry screens, and learned to exploit the Roman tendency to pursue too aggressively. Belisarius had to repeatedly discipline his men for pursuing beyond safe distances, a recurring problem with cavalry troops who let the excitement of combat override tactical discipline. After weeks of skirmishing and preparation, Viticus launched the main Gothic assault on the walls, an all-out attempt to take the city by direct storm. The assault came simultaneously against multiple sections of the wall. The Goths brought up siege towers, which is an enormous wooden structure designed to allow attackers to reach the top of the walls. They also used battering rams against the gates to weaken them. The assault began at dawn, with the Gothic army advancing in massive columns toward the walls from multiple directions. The siege towers were neutralized. The Gothic siege towers were enormous, as high as the walls themselves. They were pushed by oxen toward the wall. If they reached the wall and the drawbridges dropped, the Gothics could pour men directly on top of the wall. Belisarius had anticipated this and prepared a specific response. He had posted his heaviest catapultists and archers at points targeting the path where the towers would have to travel. As the towers approached, Roman artillery opened fire with devastating effect. The oxen pulling the towers were targeted. Belisarius personally directed archers and artillery to aim at the animals rather than the Gothic warriors. Without their oxen, the towers stopped moving, and they were stranded in the open. Now they became targets rather than weapons. Gothic warriors trying to push the towers manually were cut down by arrow fire from the wall. Now with the towers neutralized, the Goths started to use the ladders to climb the wall. Hand-to-hand fighting started in multiple locations. Belisarius rode along the walls on horseback, directing the defense, moving to where the pressure was greatest. He is described as giving orders with complete calm in the midst of the chaos. At one point, a section of the wall, near the Praenestina gates, were nearly breached. Belisarius personally redirected troops from quieter sections to reinforce this breaking point. Near the Tiber gate, the Goths had concentrated enormous force against this section. The Roman garrison here was outnumbered and beginning to give ground. but Belisarius arrived personally at this section with his bodyguard cavalry fighting on foot alongside the wall garrison. The crisis was eventually stabilized, but it was extremely close. By the end of the day, the Gothic assault had been repulsed across all sections of the wall. Gothic losses were extremely heavy. The scale of Gothic dead is described as very large. Roman losses were significant, but much lighter. The defensive advantages of the walls combined with Roman tactical superiority in archery and artillery kept casualties manageable. The Goths had spent an enormous amount of energy and blood and had nothing to show for it. But if the Goths had more numbers, why did it fail? The Illyrian walls, even in their degraded state, were simply good fortifications. Direct assault on walls of that quality without overwhelming artillery superiority was extremely costly. The pre-positioned artillery, the targeted killing of the oxen, the stockpiled arrows reflected months of careful planning. The combination of skilled horses and catapultists gave the Romans a crushing advantage in range firepower that Goths could not match, and attacking 12 miles of wall simultaneously required perfect coordination that the Goth command structure could not achieve. Different sections of the attack developed at different rates, and Belisarius could shift defenders to a crisis faster than the Goths could exploit them. After the failure of the Great Assault, Viticus settled into the war of attrition. Both sides were suffering, and the question was who would break first. Inside Rome, the conditions were bad. Food supplies were running low, diseases were spreading, and morale was wavering. Among the wealthy Roman citizens, a pro-Gothic faction was becoming more vocal. Men with property outside the city, and with Gothic business connections, some feared they might be killed if the city fell and would rather surrender. Some Roman aristocrats were sending secret messages to Viticus, essentially committing treason, by promising to open the gates if the Goths offered favorable terms. A group of Isaurian soldiers, who were mercenaries from Asia Minor, were discovered to have been in a treasonous communications with the Goths, promising to open the Illyrian gate. Belisarius had them arrested. Some were ultimately executed, but Belisarius was more interested in identifying the full scope of the conspiracy rather than simple revenge. This episode forced Belisarius to reduce the number of gates that were actively used and to increase scrutiny at those that remained open. During the siege, Pope Silverius reportedly entered into communications with the Goths. There is evidence he sent letters to Viticus. The exact content and nature of those communications is disputed. Some historians believe he was generally plotting to betray the city. Others say that he was simply trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution to protect his city. Antonina, Belisarius' wife, was extremely close to Empress Theodora in Constantinople. Theodora had her own candidate for a pope, a man named Viligus, who had promised Theodora he would support her preferred theological position. Antonina summoned Pope Silverius to a meeting. Silverius arrived at the meeting and was confronted with accusations of treason, specifically the alleged letters to Viticus. He was stripped of his papal authority on the spot, and he was dressed in monk's clothing, and then he was sent into exile. By late summer, the food situation inside Rome had become generally desperate. The grain supplies were nearly exhausted. Unfortunately, soldiers were being fed at the expense of civilians. Military necessity demanded it, but the suffering of the civilian population was severe. People were reportedly eating whatever they could find: dogs, rats, leathers, and sometimes even grass. The church desperately tried to maintain food distribution to the most vulnerable. Death from starvation and associated disease was becoming a regular occurrence. Belisarius wrote to Justinian with brutal honesty about the situation: the food, the disease, the treason within, and the Gothic strength outside. He begged for reinforcements and supplies. Justinian's response came in the form of 1,600 cavalry, Slavic and Hunnic horsemen sent under a general named Martinus. This was a far fewer than Belisarius needed, but it was better than nothing. The reinforcements had to fight their way through Gothic patrols to reach the city. Their arrival was a moment of enormous relief and renewed hope inside the city. But the Gothic army outside the walls were also suffering. The Gothic camps around Rome were in a low-lying marshy ground in several places. Disease was also devastating the Gothic army as well. The Goths were far from supply lines in northern Italy, feeding 30 to 50,000 men was a logistical nightmare. Local food supplies had been stripped bare. The army had eaten everything within reach and were beginning to run out. As the reinforcements arrived and its intelligence suggested the Gothic army was weakening, Belisarius made a decisive shift in strategy, from a pure defensive to an active offensive. Belisarius sent an increasingly aggressive cavalry force to raid Gothic supply lines north of Rome. Forces under his subordinate generals, Martinus and Valerian, raided Gothic supply convoys moving down from northern Italy. Gothic foraging parties were attacked and destroyed. The psychological effect on the Gothic army was significant. Desertions from the Gothic army began increasing as the raids disrupted food supplies, and from that, morale further collapsed. Ostia was Rome's ancient port, about 15 miles from the city. If Belisarius could keep Ostia open, supply ships could bring in grain up the Tiber to Rome. He sent a force to hold and fortified Ostia against Gothic attack. This succeeded. Supply ships from Sicily began moving grain up the river. This was crucial to the city's survival. The land supply routes were cut off, but the river route remained partially open. It was a good solution. Viticus had cut the roads, but he could not fully control the river. After approximately 1 year and 9 days, the Gothic army began withdrawing from Rome in March. Several factors caused this. A Roman force under the general Mundus had been operating in Dalmatia, threatening Gothic territory from the northeast. More significantly, a Roman army under John had been sent north and was raiding deep into Gothic territory. In Picenum, on the Adriatic coast, John was reportedly burning Gothic settlements, killing warriors and enslaving Gothic women and children. Gothic warriors in the siege army were receiving desperate messages from their families. Their homeland was being devastated, while they sat outside Rome, achieving nothing. The Gothic army that withdrew from Rome was a shadow of the force that had arrived. Disease had killed an enormous amount of people. Starvation and supply failures had weakened the survivors, and the army that had arrived with perhaps 50,000 men was leaving with something far smaller and far less capable. The northern raids by John created a political crisis. The Gothic warriors laying siege to Rome were not professional soldiers separated from family. They were a people in arms. Their wives and children lived in the settlements John was raiding. The psychological pressure to go home and protect their families was overwhelming. Viticus ordered the camps to be broken down, and then the army began moving north toward Ravenna, the Gothic capital in northern Italy. But Belisarius did not let them go that easy. He ordered immediate pursuit with all available cavalry. The pursuing Romans inflicted heavy additional casualties on the retreating Gothic columns. Calculating casualties for the entire siege is impossible. With precision, ancient sources are unreliable with numbers. But we can say that Gothic losses were heavy. Between battle casualties, diseases, and starvation, the Gothic army that had arrived at Rome was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Roman losses were also severe. Disease, starvation, and constant fighting had reduced and weakened Belisarius' garrison significantly. But the garrison had survived. The combination of engineering, preparation, tactical aggression through sorties, logistical innovation like the floating mills, and psychological management of his troops marks Belisarius as a commander of the highest order. If Rome had fallen in 537, the entire Italian campaign would have almost certainly have ended in failure. Justinian's dream of reconquering the Western Empire would have been dealt a fatal blow. Even though they survived the siege, Belisarius understood something that the common people did not fully grasp. The war was far from over. The Gothic kingdom had not been destroyed. Viticus had retreated to Ravenna, the heavily fortified Gothic capital in northeastern Italy, with what remained of his army. Other Gothic forces held numerous cities and fortresses across northern Italy. The campaign ahead would be as demanding as anything that had come before. With Rome secured for now, Belisarius immediately organized the pursuit of the retreating Gothic army. He understood that a retreating, demoralized enemy is most vulnerable, and allowing Viticus to reach Ravenna and rebuild his strength would simply prolong the war. He sent his subordinate general, John of Armenia, northeast toward Picenum on the Adriatic coast with a fast cavalry force. He also sent Martinus and Valerian to operate in Tuscany, securing the western side of the peninsula. He himself led the main force north along the Via Flaminia, the ancient Roman road running northeast from Rome toward Rimini. The advance through northern central Italy produced rapid results. Narni, Spoleto, and Perugia all fell relatively quickly. The Gothic garrisons were either surrendering or fleeing as the Roman columns approached. In most cases, Belisarius' policy of treating surrendered populations with respect was paying dividends. Cities were more willing to open their gates when they knew they would not be sacked or killed. But Rimini was the most important capture of this phase. It created the first serious problem of the campaign. John and his cavalry force raced ahead of the main army and captured Rimini, a strategically vital city on the Adriatic coast. This was both brilliant and dangerous. Brilliant because Rimini's capture threatened Ravenna directly and shocked the Gothic high command. It was also dangerous because John had advanced far behind the supporting distance of the main army. He was isolated with a small force very close to the main Gothic stronghold. When Belisarius heard the news of his capture, he was deeply concerned about John's exposed position, but he also could not ignore the strategic opportunity that the capture of Rimini presented. But soon another problem arose, which was the problem of his subordinate commanders. Belisarius commanded an army of which was ethnically and politically diverse, which caused his own problems. For example, the officers commanding these units were not soldiers following orders. They were powerful men with their own ambitions, their own political connections in Constantinople, and their own ideas about how the campaign should be fought. John of Armenia was the most problematic. He is described as brave to the point of recklessness, ambitious, and increasingly contemptuous of Belisarius' authority. He had political connections at court. He was a nephew of a powerful general named Vitalian, and he knew Justinian was watching all of his commanders for signs of exclusive loyalty to Belisarius rather than to the emperor himself. Justinian's deliberate policy of maintaining multiple power centers in his military to prevent any single general from becoming too powerful was one of the fundamental weaknesses of the Italian campaign. Belisarius was brilliant enough to overcome almost any military obstacle, but the political obstacles placed by his own emperor was far harder to navigate. He was essentially fighting two enemies, one external and one internal. But some good news did come. In the summer of 538, Justinian sent reinforcements to Italy, approximately 7,000 soldiers. This was welcome, but the reinforcements came with a complication. They were commanded by Narses, a senior court official and the Grand Chamberlain of the imperial palace. Narses was an interesting figure, a eunuch who had risen to enormous power at court through intelligence, loyalty, and administrative brilliance. He would later prove to be a great military commander. But in 538, he arrived in Italy as a court official with imperial authority rather than a subordinate military commander under Belisarius. Narses technically outranked Belisarius at court, but Belisarius was the overall military commander in Italy. Narses had his own views on strategy that frequently conflicted with Belisarius and several other subordinate commanders, particularly John of Armenia. He was beginning to play Narses against Belisarius to avoid following orders he disliked. This was not an accident. Justinian wanted to maintain divided command so that no single general could accumulate unchecked power. It was politically sound from Justinian's perspective and militarily catastrophic from the perspective of conducting a successful campaign. The consequences of divided command became tragically apparent in the disaster at Milan. To give some background, Milan was the great city of northern Italy. Once itself an imperial city, it was held by a small Roman garrison. A Gothic force under a commander named Urias, supported by Burgundian allies from across the Alps, had surrounded and besieged it. The Roman garrison sent desperate appeals for relief to Belisarius. He ordered John of Armenia and Martinus, whose forces were closest, to relieve Milan immediately. But John refused to move. His forces, without direct orders from Narses, claiming that Narses outranked Belisarius, he could only obey Narses. Narses, for some reason, did not give the order in time. Belisarius sent increasingly urgent messages. John and other commanders debated, delayed, and argued about authority and protocol, while the Roman commanders argued about who had authority over whom. The Gothic and Burgundian forces took Milan by storm. Once they had taken the city, the entire male population of Milan was massacred. Women were distributed as slaves to the Burgundian allies, and the city was systematically burned and demolished. Milan was one of the greatest cities in the world, and now it was reduced to ruins. When news reached Justinian, he was furious. He recalled Narses to Constantinople, implicitly acknowledging the divided command had produced this disaster. But he did not punish John or the other commanders who had refused to obey Belisarius. This was a profound message to Belisarius and to everyone watching Justinian. He would not fully back his general's authority over his subordinates. Belisarius could command in the field but could not count on unconditional imperial support when his authority was challenged. After Milan, the energy and momentum that had characterized Belisarius' advance began to slow and fracture. With the Narses recalled and John theoretically back under Belisarius' sole command, the campaign continued. But the damage from the Milan disaster and the months of command dysfunction had given the Goths time to recover. Viticus was still in Ravenna with a substantial force. The Gothic garrison held numerous fortified cities across northern Italy, and new Gothic forces had arrived from across the Alps, from Frankish and Burgundian warriors hired as mercenaries. The Frankish king had actually sent an army into northern Italy to help the Goths, but this was a fake reason. The real reason why he did this was to plunder both sides indiscriminately. The next phase of the war consisted largely of sieges of fortified Gothic cities across northern Italy, such as Osimo, Fiesole, Oximum, and Urbino. Several factors are worth noting about this phase. Belisarius' siege methods, his preferred approach combined blockade, such as surrounding the city and cutting off supply, rather than direct assault. Psychological pressure, making the garrison understand that relief was not coming and surrender was the better option, and targeted assault, where specific weakness in the walls or gates would be exploited. By late 539, the strategic situation had shifted decisively in Rome's favor. The Gothic cities across northern and central Italy had largely been captured or neutralized. The Gothic army had been ground down by years of campaigning. Viticus and what remained of the Gothic leadership were concentrated in Ravenna, their last major stronghold. And Ravenna was generally formidable, surrounded by marshes and lagoons that made direct military assault nearly impossible. But before Belisarius could deliver the final blow, a new and urgent problem was emerging that would fundamentally change everything. Intelligence reaching both Constantinople and Belisarius' headquarters in Italy indicated that the Persian Shah, Khosrow I, was preparing to break the eternal peace of 532 and launch a massive invasion of the Roman eastern territory. This intelligence changed Justinian's calculations entirely. The eastern front was virtually undefended because Belisarius had taken most of the eastern army to Italy. A Persian invasion could threaten not just territory, but potentially Antioch, the third greatest city in the empire. Justinian began pressuring Belisarius to end the Italian campaign quickly so eastern forces could be redeployed. This pressure created a dilemma for Belisarius. Ravenna probably couldn't be taken by direct assault. The marshes protecting it made conventional siege warfare extremely difficult. A prolonged blockade might work, but would take time Justinian was insisting he did not have. By early 540, Viticus and the Gothic leadership inside Ravenna could see their position was ultimately hopeless. Viticus sent envoys to Justinian in Constantinople, proposing a negotiated settlement. The terms he offered were, the Goths would surrender all of Italy south of the Po River to the empire. They would pay significant tribute to Constantinople, and they would retain only the territory north of the Po as a Gothic kingdom, under nominal Roman suzerainty, which is basically a puppet state. The emperor was inclined to accept. The deal would give Rome most of Italy, secure tribute, and free the entire army for the coming Persian War. From Constantinople's perspective, it was a reasonable outcome, but Belisarius was horrified. He believed that a Gothic kingdom north of the Po would simply rebuild its strength and eventually reconquer the rest of Italy. This prediction would later turn out to be true. He argued passionately against accepting the deal. Total victory was within reach. He should be given the time and resources to take Ravenna. Justinian overruled him. He sent commissioners to Italy with instructions to accept the Gothic terms. The Gothic leadership decided that if they could not defeat Belisarius, they might co-opt him. They made a secret approach to their besieging enemy with an interesting proposal. They offered Belisarius the crown of the Gothic Empire. The Gothic king and his leadership were offering to surrender Ravenna, submit their armies, and recognize Belisarius as emperor of the West, only if he would break with Justinian and rule Italy independently. But why would the Goths make this offer? The Goths were not stupid. They understood that an Italy ruled by a distant emperor in Constantinople was likely to be heavily exploited and lightly defended. They had seen how Justinian treated Belisarius, underfunding him, sending inadequate reinforcements, and interfering with divided command. They calculated that a strong Western emperor based in Italy, even one who had been their enemy, would provide better governance and more reliable defense than Justinian ruling from Constantinople. They also calculated that Belisarius was brilliant, honorable, and respected by the Italian population. He was someone they could actually live with as a ruler. Roman generals had claimed the purple before. It happened many times in the preceding centuries. Belisarius was at this moment probably the most famous and most loved military figure in the Roman world, more celebrated than Justinian himself in many parts of the empire. Accepting the Goths' offer made sense. It would have given Belisarius power, authority, and the resources to actually complete the work of restoration that Justinian's interference was making very much impossible. Belisarius appeared to accept the Gothic offer. He sent word back to the Gothic leadership that he would be willing to be an emperor. The Goths opened the gates of Ravenna and allowed the Roman army to enter. And then Belisarius did nothing. He entered Ravenna. He accepted the Gothic surrender. He took Viticus prisoner. He secured the enormous Gothic treasury, and he made absolutely no move to claim the imperial title. When Gothic leaders approached him expecting the proclamation, he gave them nothing. The offer had been used purely as a tactical device to take Ravenna without a siege. The Gothic reaction was fury, humiliation, and a sense of betrayal. They had been deceived by a man they had trusted. Viticus was sent to Constantinople as a prisoner. The Gothic treasury, accumulated over generations, was shipped east to Justinian. Let me know what you think about this offer in the comments below. Should Belisarius have accepted the offer of ruling over the Goths? And would that lead to a war with Justinian? Belisarius may have genuinely considered the offer. His career might have gone very differently had he accepted. But Belisarius' loyalty to Justinian was genuine, and also probably a blindside in his judgment. Ravenna fell to Belisarius in May 540. When news reached Constantinople that Ravenna had fallen, the reaction was extraordinary. Justinian was overjoyed. The Gothic capital had fallen, the king was captured, and the treasure was secured. The great reconquest of the West seemed complete. But there was also something else. In the midst of the celebrations in Constantinople, a more complicated political reality was emerging. Belisarius was without question the most celebrated military figure in the Roman world. The Italian population had genuinely loved him, his soldiers were loyal, and he had personally refused an offer of the Western imperial throne. To Justinian, this was deeply alarming. Justinian was fundamentally afraid of Belisarius' popularity, not because Belisarius had ever shown the slightest disloyalty, quite the opposite, but precisely because a man that popular, that militarily brilliant, and that loved by his troops was an existential threat to a paranoid emperor simply by existing. Before Belisarius could even fully consolidate the conquest of Ravenna, a letter arrived from Justinian. The official reason was the Persian emergency. Khosrow I had indeed broken the eternal peace and launched a devastating invasion of Syria, and Antioch, the third greatest city in the empire, had been sacked. The eastern frontier was in crisis, and Belisarius was needed. This was real and legitimate. But the speed and manner of the recall before Belisarius could finish organizing the Italian conquest strikes historians as revealing more than military necessity. When Belisarius left Italy in 540, the consequences were immediately devastating. The Gothic survivors had not been fully pacified. Gothic garrisons still held numerous smaller fortresses and cities around Italy. Without Belisarius' presence and authority, the Roman administration of Italy immediately began to fragment. The commanders who replaced him were capable men, but had none of his authority, his judgment, or his ability to manage the complex political landscape of Italy. Within a year of his departure, a Gothic resistance movement had coalesced around a new leader, a Gothic warrior named Totila, who had proved to be one of the most capable enemies Rome had ever faced. The Gothic War, which everyone believed was essentially over, would in fact continue for another 13 years. The sack of Antioch shook confidence in Justinian's reign more than any single event since the Nika riots. The emperor who had reconquered Africa and Italy had allowed the third city of his empire to be sacked and its population enslaved. Justinian's response to the Persian catastrophe was only to do one thing that ever made sense: send Belisarius back to the eastern frontier. Whatever complicated feelings the emperor had about his greatest general's fame and power, the military reality demanded it. There was no one else that he trusted with the job. Belisarius was appointed commander of the East in 541 in order to deal with the Persian threat. When Belisarius arrived on the eastern front, he found a situation that was not good. The Eastern Army had been stripped of its best troops for the Italian campaign years earlier and was never fully properly rebuilt. What remained was a mixture of second-line garrison troops, newly recruited troops, of limited training and experience. Morale was catastrophic. The army that had watched Antioch fall without being able to intervene was demoralized and frightened. The fortress network on the frontier was the chain of fortified positions that was supposed to provide defense was in a poor repair after years of neglect. Belisarius set about the familiar work of reorganization and rebuilding morale with his characteristic energy. But the tools available to him were far inferior to what he had commanded in Italy. Belisarius' eastern campaign of 541 is less celebrated than his Italian or earlier Persian campaigns, and it is worth understanding why. Khosrow had retreated back into Persian territory after the sack of Antioch with plunder and captives. He had achieved his objectives for that campaign season. Belisarius' task was to deter further Persian aggression, and if possible recover Roman prestige by striking into Persian territory, which led to the attempt on Nablus. Belisarius led his army toward Nablus, the great fortress city that had been the bone of contention between Rome and Persia for generations. It was now in Persian hands, and recapturing it would be a significant strategic and psychological victory. But the attempt failed, not through any fault of Belisarius' tactics, but because his army was not strong enough to take a fortified city of that strength. His subordinate commanders were uncooperative and unreliable. The intelligence that should have supported the operations did not arrive in time. Unable to take Nisibis, Belisarius pivoted to a different objective, a Persian-held fortress called Cisaran, deeper in Mesopotamia. This he did take, but here again the cooperation problems again became disastrous. Belisarius had sent a force under an Arab-allied commander named Arthurius to raid deep into Persian territory and gather intelligence. Arthurius simply disappeared. He apparently conducted some raiding on his own account, collected plunder, and withdrew without informing Belisarius or supporting the main operations. Without Arthurius' forces, Belisarius was isolated deeper in Persian territory than what was safe. He was forced to withdraw. The 541 Eastern Campaign achieved little strategic success and demonstrated that without adequate forces and reliable subordinates, even Belisarius could not achieve decisive results. But what happened next made the military situation completely irrelevant, because something arrived in 541 that made human warfare look trivial by comparison. That same year, a disease appeared in the Egyptian port city of Placenum near the mouth of the Nile. Within months, it had spread along every trade route in the Mediterranean world. By 542, it had reached Constantinople itself. Modern scientists analyzing ancient DNA from burial sites across the Mediterranean have confirmed what contemporaries suspected. This was bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It was the same pathogen that would return centuries later as the Black Death of 1347. It originated in Central Asia, probably carried by rats on grain ships moving along the Silk Road, an Indian Ocean trade route, when it entered the Mediterranean through Egypt. And from Egypt, it moved along shipping routes to every port in the Mediterranean. Constantinople was struck with particular curiosity. From Constantinople, it radiated outward into the western Mediterranean. Like Procopius, described what they saw in the city. The fevers were initially mild, giving victims false hope that they were merely mildly ill. Then, within days, the appearance of bulbuses, swollen, painful lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck. Some victims fell into deep coma and died without regaining consciousness. Others became delirious, throwing themselves out of windows or rushing into the streets in agony. Others vomited blood. The more fortunate died quickly. A doctor's position that the disease did not discriminate. Rich and poor, healthy and infirm, young and old, all died equally. Doctors could do nothing. No pattern of behavior protected anyone. This absolute randomness was psychologically devastating. The streets of Constantinople filling with unburied corpses because the death toll overwhelmed all systems of burial. Bodies were stacked in buildings, thrown into the sea, piled on ships, and floated out of the harbors. The smell of death hung over the city for months. The mortality figures for the plague of Justinian are debated by modern historians, but all agreed the scale was catastrophic. The plague did not strike once and disappear. It returned in waves throughout the 540s, 550s, and 560s, each time killing more of the population that had survived the previous outbreak. The plague also affected the army. Recruitment became nearly impossible. There were simply fewer young men available. The federate barbarian troops that the empire increasingly relied upon became even more essential as Roman manpower collapsed, and therefore more expensive and more politically powerful. Since people were dying en masse, this hurt the economy. This meant less money for soldiers, fortifications, ships, and for everything the empire needed to function militarily. Throughout the empire, farmland was abandoned due to lack of labor and food prices. Famine strikes in areas that had previously been self-sufficient. The agricultural collapse in Italy became catastrophic when the plague killed much of the surviving population. In 542, the Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague. For weeks, it was unclear whether he would survive. This created an immediate political crisis. When it became apparent that Justinian might die from a plague, a question that had been lurking beneath the surface of imperial politics burst into the open. Who would succeed him? Justinian had no children. There was no obvious or designated heir. The question of succession in the Roman world. Emperors were made by armies as much as by bloodlines, and everyone knew it. Several generals, including men in Belisarius' circle, apparently said something to the effect that they would not accept an emperor chosen by the empress, Theodora, if Justinian died. They were not necessarily declaring for any particular candidate, but they were publicly questioning Theodora's ability to manage the situation. Belisarius was present when these conversations occurred. Whether he actively participated or merely failed to prevent others from speaking is unclear. The sources conflict each other, but he was associated with these discussions. Justinian eventually recovered from the plague, and when he recovered, he was informed of what had been said about him and the throne. The consequences for Belisarius were severe and immediate. He was recalled from the Eastern Command in 542 AD, and he was stripped of his position as commander of the East. But most tragically was that his personal bucellari, his household troops, the battle-hardened veterans who had fought with him from Persia to Italy, the men who were essentially his private army and the foundation of his military power, were taken from him. While this event was unfolding in Constantinople, on the western frontier, the situation in Italy, which everyone had thought was settled by the fall of Ravenna, was catastrophically deteriorating. The Gothic War had not ended with Viticus's capture. Scattered Gothic forces remained across Italy. What they lacked was leadership. In 541, they found it. Their new leader, Totila, was a Gothic nobleman who had survived the fall of Ravenna and the years of Roman conquest. In 541, he was elected king by the remaining Gothic warriors, a desperate, depleted people who needed a leader capable of reversing what seemed like inevitable extinction. Totila outmaneuvered, outfought, and outsmarted Roman commanders who were competent, but none of whom approached Belisarius' level. He combined speed, tactical flexibility, and strategic visions in ways that consistently surprised his opponents. Totila understood that the Gothic War had devastated the Italian population. Farmers, craftsmen, and small landowners who had been crushed between two armies for years. He deliberately positioned himself as the champion of the Italian poor against the Romans. He freed slaves who joined his army, an extraordinary move that gained him enormous support among the most oppressed layer of Italian society. He also canceled debts owed to Roman landlords. Totila was not simply trying to restore Gothic rule, but build a new coalition of Goths, Italian poor, and disaffected Romans against the imperial reconquest. Whether this could have lasted as a stable political order, we will never know, but as a wartime strategy, it was effective. The speed and scale of Totila's recovery of Italy was staggering. Without Belisarius, the Roman administration and military in Italy simply fell apart. In 542, the Battle of Faventia and Magello, two significant Gothic victories in northern Italy where Totila's forces routed Roman armies significantly larger than his own. These victories were the psychological turning point. Roman troops began to understand that their commanders could not protect them. The next year, Naples fell. Totila swept south and laid siege to Naples, the great port city that Belisarius had taken so cleverly years ago. The Roman garrison, inadequately supplied and unsupported from Constantinople, surrendered after a siege. Totila's treatment of the garrison was extraordinary. He allowed them to leave with their weapons and their honor intact, gave food to the starving civilian population, and repaired the city's water supply. He was performing a masterclass in winning hearts and minds while simultaneously defeating Roman armies. Constantinople's response was paralyzed by the multiple simultaneously crises. The plague was killing the population and destroying tax revenue. The Persian frontier needed constant attention, and Justinian was still managing the political fallout of his own near death. By 544, the situation in Italy had become too dire to ignore. Tortilla controlled most of southern Italy and was advancing steadily northward. City after city was falling or defecting. The Roman position was on the verge of complete collapse. Justinian made the only decision that made military sense. He sent Belisarius back to Italy. But the terms of this return tell us everything about how the relationship between Emperor and Belisarius had changed since the triumphant years. Belisarius was given no significant reinforcements. His bucellari had been partially restored, but were a shadow of their former strength. He was also given no additional funding beyond what was already committed to Italy, and he was given no enhanced authority over the quarreling subordinate commanders who had mismanaged the Italian situation before. Justinian sent Belisarius back to Italy with essentially nothing. The implication was either that Justinian genuinely believed his name alone could restore the situation, which reflects a kind of desperate magical thinking, or that he was sending him back knowing failure was likely, which would conveniently justify further humiliation of a general whose fame he resented. Let me know which one you think it is in the comments below. But another view of it was Justinian's was resource strained by the plague's fiscal damage and the Persian threat, and could not send more even if he wanted to. The inadequacy of the resources was real, even if it was also convenient, so it could be a mix of both. When Belisarius arrived in Italy, the picture was almost unrecognizable from the country he had left in 540. Tortilla controlled most of southern Italy. These were cities that Roman armies had taken at great cost, and they were now in Gothic hands again. The Roman garrisons that remained were demoralized, unpaid, and on the verge of deserting. The Italian citizen population, exhausted by a decade of war and devastated by plagues, in many places actively supporting Tortilla rather than the Roman reconquest. Not having the support of the common people made the resistance higher. Despite all of this setbacks, Belisarius tried to fix the situation. The soldiers already in Italy were months behind in their pay, a catastrophic failure that was the root cause of much of the military collapse. Unpaid soldiers did not fight well, they desert. They plunder civilians to feed themselves, and they also lose faith in their commanders. Belisarius also wrote repeatedly to Justinian demanding that pay must be sent immediately, arguing that he could not fight a war with troops who were starving and in debt. Justinian's response was inadequate and slow. Belisarius was then reduced to the humiliating necessity of borrowing money from wealthy Italian landowners to pay his troops, going personally in debt to fund a campaign that the emperor could not properly resource. But this wasn't the only problem. The problem of uncooperative subordinate commanders was now worse than ever. The commanders in Italy had developed their own political relationships with Constantinople, their own agendas, and their own conflicts with each other. They did not simply obey Belisarius. For example, John of Armenia, still the most problematic, operated largely independently, pursuing his own strategy and ignoring Belisarius' order when they conflicted with his preference. Other commanders similarly prioritized their own positions and their own relationships with Justinian over coordinated obedience to Belisarius' overall command. The reason Belisarius could achieve miracles with inadequate forces was precisely that every element of his plan worked in coordination. When subordinates operated independently, the whole system broke down. The most urgent military problem Belisarius faced on his return was the fact that Rome itself was again under threat. Totila had swept north and was besieging the Eternal City, the same city Belisarius had defended so brilliantly 8 years earlier. Belisarius organized a fleet of supply ships on the Tiber to try to run supplies into Rome, past the Gothic siege lines, essentially the same approach that he had used during the first siege. He commanded this operation personally, fighting his way up the Tiber in a desperate effort to reach the city. Unfortunately for him, the attempt failed. Gothic forces had blocked the river more effectively than in the previous siege. The Goths stretched an iron chain across the Tiber, and constructed wooden towers on both banks, essentially turning the river into a fortified wall. Any relief fleet coming upriver would be funneled into a killing ground. Belisarius was fighting fiercely, but he was unable to break through. He had to withdraw, and in December 546 Rome fell to Totila, the city that Belisarius had taken so triumphantly in 536 that he had defended so brilliantly through the Great Siege, and was now in Gothic hands. The manner of its fall was devastating. The Roman garrison were starving and losing hope of release, so they opened the gates at night. Totila entered Rome in the middle of the night. His treatment of the city was characteristically complex. He did not massacre the population, but he expelled most of its inhabitants and left Rome almost empty. He apparently considered demolishing the city entirely, razing it to the ground, but Belisarius sent a remarkable letter to Totila, pleading with him not to destroy Rome, arguing that destroying the greatest city in the world could be an act of barbarism that would stain Totila's historical reputation forever, regardless of who won the war. Whether moved by this argument or by his own political calculations, Totila did not destroy Rome, but he stripped it for its resources further and left it largely empty. After the fall of Rome, Belisarius wrote a letter to Justinian. In this letter, he stated plainly that he had arrived in Italy with no money, no soldiers, and no horses. He documented the failures of his subordinates and the impossibility of coordinating a campaign with commanders who would not obey him. He described the condition of the Italian population in the landscape, such as the plague and the agricultural collapse. He argued that without immediate reinforcements and proper funding, the campaign could not succeed, and Italy would be lost. He asked that Justinian either properly resource the campaign or acknowledge that it could not be won with the current resources. Unfortunately, Justinian's response was inadequate. He just sent some reinforcements, but it wasn't enough. He also sent no meaningful enhancements of Belisarius' authority over his subordinates. With all this mess, Belisarius was not dragging himself to destruction like some commanders broken by failure. He was not becoming cruel or corrupt. He continued to treat his soldiers and the Italian population with the same fairness and respect that had characterized his entire career. But the energy and confidence that had characterized his earlier campaigns was clearly diminished. The Belisarius of the Vandal campaign and the Belisarius of 545 were the same man, but the gravity of the situation weighed heavy on his mind. Meanwhile, on the eastern front, Khosrow was not standing still. After the campaign of 540, he continued probing Roman defenses, launching raids into Syria and Armenia. Roman commanders on the eastern frontier without Belisarius were struggling to contain him. The empire was being pulled apart simultaneously by two major wars on opposite ends of its territory, a strategic nightmare that no amount of individual skill could fully overcome. In 549, Justinian recalled Belisarius from Italy for the second time, and final time. The official reason was vague. The practical reality was that the Italian campaign under Belisarius' second command had failed to reverse Totila's advances. Rome had fallen. Most of Italy was in Gothic hands. The campaign had consumed enormous resources and produced nothing. But the fault was not primarily Belisarius. The fault lay in the inadequacy of resources, the failure of coordination among subordinates, and the structural dysfunction of how Justinian managed his military. Belisarius had been set up to fail from the beginning. The great vision of restoring the Roman Empire that Justinian had proclaimed and Belisarius had nearly achieved in 540 had essentially collapsed. Italy would eventually be reconquered, but not by Belisarius. It would be by the eunuch Narses, who finally defeated and killed Totila at the Battle of Bustus Galamra in 552 and completed the reconquest. Narses was given what Belisarius had wanted: adequate resources and unified command. With these tools, even a man who had never commanded a major campaign before could win. When Belisarius returned to Constantinople from his second campaign in 549, he was approximately 49 years old. By the standards of the 6th century, he was already a middle-aged man who had spent the better part of his 30-years-long campaign. He had fought in Persia, Africa, Italy, and on the Danube frontier. He had endured wounds, plagues, political humiliation, and the slow destruction of everything he had worked so hard to build. What happened to him in the years between 549 and 559 is sparsely documented. A man who had been the most written about military figure in the empire for 2 decades essentially disappears from the sources. What we do know is that he retained his seniority rank and his considerable personal wealth. Roman generals of his seniority received a share of captured treasures, land grants, and imperial gifts that made successful commanders extremely wealthy. He maintained his house in Constantinople. He retained some form of ceremonial military title, though he was stripped of active command. Antonina, Belisarius' wife, remained close to Empress Theodora, and through that connection maintained considerable influence at court. After Theodora's death in 548, Antonina lost her primary source of court power. For the empire more broadly, Theodore's death removed the single most stabilizing influence on Justinian's increasingly erratic governance. With Theodore's death, Justinian's theological obsession deepened. His political judgment became more uncertain, and the court around him became more corrupt. In the winter of 558, a Hun leader named Zabergan led a massive raid across the Danube into Roman territory. This was not the first Hunnic raid of the decade, but it was far most dangerous. Zandbergen led a force around 7,000 cavalry, a substantial raiding force operating in the depths of winter when Roman defensive response were at their lowest. The raid split into three columns, one heading towards Greece and Thessalonica, one toward the Thracian coast, and the main column driving directly towards Constantinople. The main column penetrated the long walls, the outer defensive border about 40 miles west of Constantinople, apparently finding them partially unmaintained. By early 559, his cavalry were reportedly visible from the walls of Constantinople itself, raiding villages and estates almost within sight of the imperial capital. The city had not faced direct military threat since the Nika riots nearly 30 years earlier. The civilian population flooded into the churches. Wealthy families began loading their valuables onto ships. Justinian himself was reportedly frightened. By this time, he was an old man, watching from the walls of his capital as enemy cavalry burned villages in the distance. The regular military forces available in the immediate vicinity of Constantinople were small, a few thousand soldiers of limited quality. The main armies were committed elsewhere, on the Persian frontier, in Italy, and in Africa. There was simply nothing immediately available to meet this threat. From this crisis, Justinian turned to the one man whose name still meant military certainty, Belisarius. He was approximately 59 years old by now, and had been in semi-retirement for nearly a decade. He had not commanded in the field since 549. Here was a man who had been humiliated, stripped of his troops, publicly degraded, and left to sit idle while others completed the work he had begun, and was now being asked to save the empire one more time with whatever he could scrap together at the last minute. Belisarius was given approximately 300 veterans from his old Bucellari, who had been retained in some ceremonial capacity, plus whatever volunteers could be quickly assembled from the city itself. Some accounts suggest that perhaps 2,000 men total, a figure that in itself may be generous. When Belisarius surveyed the situation, he immediately identified the fundamental reality. He could not fight 7,000 cavalry in open battle with 300 veterans and some assembled volunteers. Direct confrontation would be suicide. So he did what he had always done. He refused to fight the battle the enemy wanted to fight and instead designed a completely different engagement. He selected a position near a village called Miletantis, approximately 20 miles from Constantinople, where the terrain naturally constrained the enemy's cavalry's ability to use their numerical advantage. The position was in a narrow passage of a ground restricted by forest and broken terrain on both sides. In this confined space, the Krutrigers' overwhelming numerical superiority in cavalry was neutralized. They could not deploy their full force simultaneously. Belisarius used the forest edges strategically, positioning soldiers among the trees where they could not be seen and where the visual uncertainty would multiply their apparent numbers. Belisarius had a small army make as much noise and visual display as possible. Trumpets and banners. This was done to make the army look bigger than its real size. He staged a hunting expedition in the forest near the Krutrigers' camp, deliberately letting Krutriger scouts see Roman cavalry moving through the trees in apparently large numbers. They could not tell how many men were actually here. He organized false signal fires at various points around the Krutrigers' positions, creating the impression that large Roman forces were converging from multiple directions. The psychological objective was to make Zabergen uncertain about what he was actually facing, uncertainty that would cause him to rethink about taking the city. When the battle happened, the Krutrigers were channeled into the narrow space by the terrain. Belisarius' veterans fought with the discipline and skill of men who had campaigned together for decades. At a critical moment, Belisarius committed a cavalry reserve that swept around the Krutrigers' flank through the forest, appearing to come from a different direction that the enemy had thought was secure. The result was that the Krutrigers broke and fled. The threat to Constantinople was eliminated. Belisarius followed up his tactical victory with characteristic energy. He sent forces to catch the retreating enemy and organize the recovery of the civilian captives and plundered property. The other columns of Zabergen's invasion, hearing of the defeat of the main force, also withdrew across the Danube. The crisis was over. The invasion that had sent the city into a panic had been defeated by an old man with 300 veterans and some volunteers. This was done through superior intelligence, terrain choice, and psychological manipulation, and the quality of veteran soldiers who trusted their commanders completely. One might expect this extraordinary achievement to have restored Belisarius to full honor and imperial favor. Well, it did not. What happened instead is one of the most revealing and disturbing episodes in this relationship between Belisarius and Justinian. The emperor expressed relief that the crisis was now over, but he did not publicly celebrate Belisarius or restore him to full military command. He actually, in some sources, entered in negotiations with Zabergan, apparently paying him off to leave Roman territory permanently. The negotiations with Zagreben deeply angered Belisarius. He had won a military victory, and the emperor had immediately converted into a diplomatic transaction that involved paying the enemy he had just defeated. To understand Belisarius' final years, we need to understand how fragile and exhausted the empire had become by the late 550s. The recurring waves of plague throughout the 540s and 550s had dramatically reduced the population of the eastern Mediterranean. There were simply fewer Romans, which meant fewer taxpayers, soldiers, farmers, and craftsmen that had been when Justinian came to power 30 years earlier. And then there was the cumulative cost of 30 years of ambitious campaigning, combined with the plague-driven revenue collapse, had produced a serious fiscal crisis. Justinian responded with increased taxation on a population that was simultaneously smaller and poorer, a policy that generated enormous resentment but limited revenue. The quality of coinage was also being substantially debased. Justinian was visibly aging and increasingly detached from governance. His theological obsessions consumed energy that should have gone into administration. The court was dominated by factional politics of extraordinary viciousness, endless conspiracies, counter-conspiracies, and power struggles among officials, generals, and imperial relatives that hurt the empire. In 562, Belisarius was accused of involvement in a conspiracy against Justinian. The sources for this episode are less complete and less reliable than earlier periods of his life. What do we know? Is a conspiracy against Justinian involving assassination or forced abdication was apparently uncovered by the imperial authorities. The conspiracy appears to have involved several senior figures, including a banker named Marcellus and various military and court officials. Whether the conspiracy was real or fabricated, whether it was a genuine assassination plot or a court intrigue manufactured to destroy political enemies, is generally uncertain and has been debated by historians. Belisarius was accused of prior knowledge of the conspiracy, not being its ringleader but of knowing it and failing to report it. This was itself a capital offense under Roman law. Whether Belisarius actually had prior knowledge, and if so, whether he had genuine involvement, or was simply the victim of testimony from conspirators seeking to implicate a famous name to give themselves leverage, is impossible to determine from the surviving sources. Belisarius was subjected to an official investigation. Stripped of his honors, his lands, and the remaining household troops, he was placed under a form of house arrest, confined to his residence in Constantinople while the investigation proceeded. For a man who had refused the Gothic crown, who had saved Constantinople, and who had given everything to the service of an emperor who constantly undervalued him, this was a devastating final backstab. But within approximately 7 or 8 months of this disgrace, Belisarius was pardoned and rehabilitated by Justinian. His property, or at least some of it, was restored. Some historians suggest Justinian's consciousness troubled him. Even in old age, he understood the injustice of what had been done to his greatest general. Others suggest political pressure from within the court. Belisarius still had friends and admirers who had argued for his rehabilitation, but the most likely answer is that the investigation had failed to produce convincing evidence of genuine involvement in the conspiracy, and even Justinian's paranoia had its limits when confronted with a lack of real proof. Whatever the reason, Belisarius was restored to his ranks, his honors, and apparently at least some portion of his property. He was once again a senator, and one of the most formally honored men in the empire. Antonina appears to have remained with him through the disgrace and rehabilitation. She devoted her surviving years and remaining wealth to charitable works, including reportedly funding a monastery. The final years of the relationship between these two men who had defined an era together are undocumented in any meaningful way. Did they meet? Did they speak? Did Justinian feel guilt or satisfaction or simple relief? Did Belisarius feel bitterness, resentment, or something approaching peace? That we do not know. What we know is that Justinian outlived Belisarius by only a matter of months. Belisarius would die in spring 546. He was 65 years old. There is no account of his final words and no description of his funeral. In the immediate decades after his death, Belisarius was remembered as a great general, but one whose story had ended badly. A victim of imperial ingratitude and court politics, the generation that had known him personally understood what he had achieved and what had been done to him. Whatever the verdict on the project of reconquest, Belisarius unquestionably changed history. The North Africa he conquered remained Roman and eventually became part of the Byzantine world for another century. The legal, cultural, and religious connections between North Africa and Constantinople that his campaign maintained had lasting consequences. The Italian campaign, however ultimately unsuccessful, preserved Roman urban traditions and the papacy's connection to Constantinople for long enough to shape the medieval West in ways that would not have existed without it. Throughout everything, Belisarius remained true to himself, fair to his soldiers, merciful to his enemies, honest with his emperor, even when honesty was dangerous, and incorruptible when corruption would have been easy, loyal when disloyalty would have gained him power. His current burial place is unknown. He was most likely buried someplace in Constantinople. Thank you for watching till the end. Let me know what you think about this topic in the comments below. If you enjoyed this type of content, subscribe for future videos.